The father's justice. I realized my son-in-law was taking everything from me, not when he lied, but when my oldest son called in the middle of the night and said, "Dad, hide. Right now." That was the moment something inside me shifted. Quiet, sharp, irreversible. My name is George Miller. I'm 66 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you kept your house steady, if you showed up for your family, things would stay where they belonged. The house on Elm Street had been mine for over 2 decades. Same creaking steps, same kitchen light that flickered once before settling, same chair by the window where my wife Nancy used to sit every morning with her coffee. After she passed, I kept everything the same, not out of habit, but because it felt like the only way to keep something from slipping away. Caleb Price walked into that space 9 years ago, well-dressed, polite, the kind of man who shook your hand with just enough pressure to feel confident, but not enough to feel threatening. My daughter Sophie loved him. That was enough for me. I gave him a seat at my table, a key to my house, access to things I never thought twice about, not just the physical kind. Trust doesn't feel like a decision when you're making it. It feels like the natural next step. He knew where everything was. The spare bourbon in the cabinet, the old documents in the study, the quiet corners of a house that had been lived in long enough to have patterns. I never noticed him learning those patterns. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't think it mattered. The night Aaron called, the house felt the same as it always had, still, predictable, safe, in a way that only comes from repetition. I had fallen asleep in the living room with the television low, the blue light flickering across the walls, when my phone buzzed against the wood of the coffee table. One vibration, then another. I picked it up without thinking. His name on the screen was enough to sit me up straight. Aaron doesn't call at midnight. He plans everything, even conversations. I answered before the second ring ended. "Dad," he said, and there was something in his voice that didn't belong to the hour. Not panic, something tighter, controlled. I looked around the room without knowing why. The hallway, the kitchen, the faint line of light under the guest bedroom door where Caleb had been staying for a few days. He told me his place was being worked on. I believed him. I had made him dinner that night, set a plate in front of him like I had 100 times before. And now my son was telling me to turn off every light, to move without being seen, to not say a word to the man sleeping under my roof. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my own breathing fill the silence between us. I had given that man everything he needed to walk freely through my life, and somehow I hadn't seen what he was doing with it. So I did what Aaron said. I moved, quietly, carefully, like someone who had just realized his own home might not be his anymore, and the only question left was, how long had it been that way? I pressed the phone tighter to my ear as I stood in the dim light of the living room, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the refrigerator down the hall. "Dad, don't talk, just listen." Aaron's voice didn't rise, didn't rush. It landed flat and steady, like something he had practiced saying more than once. That was what made it wrong. If he had sounded scared, I would have known how to respond. But this was controlled in a way that didn't leave room for questions. I opened my mouth anyway, instinct more than intention. But he cut in before I could get a word out. "Turn off every light in the house. Don't touch your laptop. Don't go near the router. Go upstairs, into the attic. Lock the door behind you." There was a brief pause, just long enough for me to hear him breathe once. "And Dad, don't tell Caleb." I turned slowly, my eyes adjusting to the shadows stretching across the hallway. The lamp beside me cast a narrow pool of yellow light that didn't quite reach the kitchen, leaving the far end of the house in a soft, uncertain gray. I reached out and clicked it off. The room dropped into darkness, not completely, but enough that shapes lost their edges. "Aaron," I said quietly, keeping my voice low without knowing why. "What's going on?" For a second, there was nothing. No answer, no background noise, just the faint line of connection between us. Then he spoke again, just as calm as before. "I need you to trust me. Do exactly what I said, right now." That word again, right now. Not later. Not when you understand. Now. I have known my son his entire life. Aaron Miller didn't improvise. He didn't react. He prepared. When he joined the FBI, it hadn't been something he talked about much. Just a shift in direction, a quiet decision that came after everything that had happened years ago. Even then, he kept the details to himself. Calls were brief. Conversations stayed on the surface. He checked in, made sure I was all right, and moved on. That was how he worked. Order, discipline, control. And in all that time, not once had he called me like this. I stepped into the hallway, the wooden floor cool under my feet, each step measured without thinking about it. The house felt different in the dark, not dangerous, but unfamiliar, like walking through a place that looked the same, but didn't feel the same anymore. "Aaron," I said again, softer this time. "You're scaring me," he exhaled, a quiet sound, almost lost in the line. "Good," he said. "That means you're paying attention." I stopped halfway down the hall, my hand brushing the wall to steady myself. This wasn't fear the way people usually mean it. No sudden panic, no racing heartbeat. It was something heavier, a slow realization settling in piece by piece. If Aaron was telling me to move like this, to stay quiet, to avoid one specific person under my own roof, then, whatever this was, it had already been happening long before this call. I glanced toward the guest bedroom door, the thin strip of light still visible at the bottom. Caleb was still awake. Or maybe he had just left the lamp on. I couldn't tell. And for the first time since he arrived, I found myself wondering what he was doing in there and how much of it I had never noticed. I moved through the house without turning anything back on, one hand trailing along the wall, counting the familiar spaces by touch instead of sight. The hallway felt longer in the dark, the corners deeper, the silence heavier than it should have been. My steps slowed as I passed the framed photos near the stairs. Sophie at the beach, Aaron in his graduation suit, Nancy standing in the backyard with that half-smile she wore when she knew I was about to say something unnecessary. I didn't stop, but I noticed them, each one catching a bit of light from somewhere behind me before disappearing again as I moved forward. The pull-down ladder to the attic was tucked into the ceiling just past the linen closet. I reached up carefully, fingers finding the edge by memory, and pulled it down as slowly as I could. The hinges creaked, not loud, but louder than anything else in the house at that moment. I froze halfway through the motion, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no door opening. Just the same low hum and the faint tick of something settling in the walls. I lowered the ladder the rest of the way and started up, placing each foot deliberately, keeping my weight centered so the wood wouldn't shift under me. The attic air was cooler than the rest of the house, carrying that dry, stored smell of old boxes and insulation. I pulled myself up and reached back to close the hatch, guiding it into place until it rested flat. The space around me was dim, two small round windows letting in a thin wash of light from the neighbor's porch across the yard. It wasn't enough to see clearly, but enough to make out shapes. Stacked boxes along the far wall, an old chair with one arm slightly lower than the other, a folded blanket draped over something I couldn't quite identify. I stepped forward and felt the boards shift slightly under my weight, a soft give that reminded me this part of the house had never been finished the way Nancy wanted. She had talked about turning it into a reading room, said the light in the afternoons would be perfect if we just fixed the windows and cleaned out the space. I had nodded, said we'd get to it eventually. We never did. Standing there now, I could almost see her sitting in that chair by the window, legs tucked under, a book open in her lap. The thought came and went quickly, replaced by the quiet pressing in from all sides. I sat down on the nearest box, the cardboard cool and slightly uneven beneath me, and leaned back against the slanted wall. The house below felt distant, not far in space, but separated by something I couldn't quite define. Every sound seemed to travel differently up here. A faint shift in the wood, the soft movement of air through the vents. I held my breath once, just to check if there was anything else I should be hearing. There wasn't, and that absence made the silence feel tighter, like it was closing in rather than just existing around me. Time slowed in a way that made it hard to tell how long I'd been sitting there. I kept my eyes on the floorboards in front of me, watching the thin lines between them, the slight variations in the grain. At some point, I realized I could see a faint seam near the edge of the room, a place where the boards didn't quite meet the way the rest of them did. I leaned forward slightly, adjusting my position to get a better angle, the light from the window catching just enough to outline it more clearly. It looked like nothing at first, just another imperfection in an old house. But the longer I stared at it, the more it stood out, like something that had been placed there on purpose. I shifted closer to the seam in the floorboards, lowering myself until my shoulder brushed the rough wood, and angled my eye toward the narrow gap. At first, all I saw was darkness, a soft blur where the light from below hadn't quite reached. Then, a lamp clicked on. The guest bedroom came into view in pieces, the edge of the bed, the corner of the dresser, the faint reflection of light across the polished floor. Caleb stepped into the frame a second later, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't belong to someone who was just passing through a room. He wasn't searching. He wasn't hesitating. He walked straight to the far wall, to the spot where an old cabinet had been sitting for years. I watched him place both hands against it and shift it aside, not with effort, but with familiarity, like he had done it before. The cabinet slid just enough to reveal a section of floor that looked no different from the rest. Same color, same grain, same worn edges from years of use. Caleb crouched down, his back partially turned, and ran his fingers along the baseboard. There was a soft click, barely audible even from above. Then the panel lifted cleanly, as if it had always been meant to open that way. A safe sat beneath it, flush with the floor, hidden in plain sight. I felt my hand tighten against the board in front of me, the wood pressing into my palm as I leaned closer without thinking. I had lived in this house for over 20 years. I had fixed leaks, replaced floor panels, repainted walls more times than I could count, and I had never seen that safe. Not once. Caleb spun the dial with steady movements, left, right, left again. No pause, no second attempt. The lock opened in seconds. He reached inside and pulled out a thick folder, bound with a simple band, the edges slightly worn, as if it had been handled more than once. He sat on the edge of the bed, the lamp casting a clear circle of light over the papers as he removed the band and opened it. From where I was, I couldn't read every line, but I didn't need to. The header stood out immediately, bold and centered at the top of the first page. Last Will and Testament. Below it, smaller, but unmistakable. Nancy Miller. For a second, I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the page as if the words might change if I blinked. I had sat beside Nancy when she signed her will. I remembered the way her hand trembled slightly, the way she pressed the pen down a little too hard at the end of her name. We had gone over every detail together, line by line, making sure nothing was left unclear. I knew what that document looked like. I knew where it was kept. A copy filed downstairs, exactly where it had always been. So what was this? Caleb turned a page, then another, his expression unchanged, focused in a way that suggested he wasn't discovering anything new, just confirming it. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and began taking photos, one page at a time, slow, careful. The light reflected briefly off the screen each time he adjusted the angle, catching the edges of the paper before settling again. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't worried about being interrupted. Every movement carried the same quiet certainty, like this was something he had already done before, or something he had always planned to do. I pressed my eye closer to the gap, the wood cool against my cheek, trying to make out more, a date, a signature. Anything that would explain why my wife's name was on a document hidden beneath a floor I thought I knew. My mind ran through the memory again, the office, the attorney, the way we left that day, believing everything was settled. That was the will, the only one. It had to be. And yet, there it was, in his hands. Caleb lowered the phone, gathered the pages back into the folder, and paused for a moment, looking down at it, as if weighing something I couldn't see. Then he slid it back into the safe, closed the door, and reset the dial with the same practiced ease. The panel dropped into place without a sound. The cabinet moved back over it, aligning perfectly with the rest of the wall, leaving no trace behind. He turned off the lamp, and the room disappeared into darkness again. I stayed where I was, still leaning over that narrow opening, my breath shallow without realizing it. The image of those words didn't fade. They settled in, sharp and clear, refusing to be explained away. I had signed my wife's will with her. I had seen it with my own eyes. So why was there another one, hidden in my house, in the middle of the night, in his hands? There was a time when my son's name carried weight in this house, not because of what he did, but because of who he was. Aaron had always been the steady one, the kind of kid who finished what he started, who double-checked things other people didn't even notice. I remember the morning they came for him. It was early, too early for visitors, too early for explanations. Two men stood at the door, jackets zipped halfway up, voices calm but firm. They didn't raise their tone. They didn't need to. Aaron listened without interrupting, his eyes moving from one face to the other, as if he was already sorting through what mattered and what didn't. They said financial fraud, like it was something simple, like it could be explained in a sentence and understood just as easily. I stood behind him, one hand on the back of the chair near the door, trying to catch the details as they spoke. Account transfers, irregular activity, a pattern that pointed directly at him. It didn't make sense, not in the way real things make sense. Aaron didn't argue. He asked one question, quiet, direct. "Can I see the records?" One of the men shook his head slightly. "You'll have access to everything through your attorney." That was how it began. The house felt different after they left with him. Not empty, but altered, like something had been moved just enough to throw everything else off balance. Sophie cried in the kitchen, her voice low, trying not to let it carry into the rest of the house. I stayed in the living room, sitting in the same chair, staring at nothing in particular, replaying the morning in pieces. We all said the same thing in different ways. It had to be a mistake. Aaron wouldn't do something like that. Not him. But belief doesn't carry weight in a courtroom, and it doesn't replace evidence when you don't have any. The case moved quickly, too quickly. Weeks felt like days, and every time we thought something might shift, it didn't. Documents were presented, clean, organized, impossible to argue against without something stronger to counter them. Aaron refused a public defender. Said he needed time, needed access, needed to understand how it had been built. But time wasn't something they gave him. The decision came down the way these things do. Quiet, final, guilty. I remember visiting him the first time after sentencing. The room was smaller than I expected, and the light overhead was too bright for the space it filled. He sat across from me, hands resting flat on the table, posture unchanged. If anything, he looked more focused than before. Not angry, not defeated, just precise. I asked him if he understood what had happened. He nodded once. "I understand what they showed," he said. "That's not the same thing as what's true." I didn't know how to respond to that. So I just sat there, listening to the sound of other conversations around us, none of them loud enough to break through. He served his time the way he did everything else, quietly, without drawing attention to himself. When he came back, something about him had shifted, but not in a way most people would notice. He spoke less, watched more. The small habits stayed the same. Early mornings, structured days, the same steady pace he had always kept. But there was an edge to it now, not visible, just present like a line drawn somewhere beneath the surface. When he told me he was applying to the FBI, I didn't ask many questions. It felt like a direction, something forward after everything that had happened. He went through the process, passed what he needed to pass, and moved into that world without looking back. At least, that's how it seemed from the outside. He called when he could, visited when the schedule allowed, kept things simple, controlled. I used to think he joined because he wanted answers, because he needed to prove something to himself, to the world, to us. But sitting there in the quiet, replaying everything I had just seen, I started to look at it differently. Aaron didn't move without purpose. He didn't rebuild himself just to stand still again. Whatever had been taken from him back then, Whatever had been constructed around his name and locked into place, he hadn't let it go. He hadn't been searching for justice. He had been waiting. And if that was true, then the question wasn't whether he knew who did it. It was how long he had known, and what he had been doing about it all this time. The pieces didn't fall into place all at once. They settled in slowly, one against the other, until there was no room left for anything else. I stayed where I was, staring at the dark lines between the floorboards, and started running it back in my head. The trial, the documents, the timing, the way everything had aligned just enough to look legitimate from the outside. Back then, it felt like a system moving forward on its own, clean, efficient, impossible to interrupt. Now it felt constructed, not rushed, not improvised, built. Caleb hadn't stumbled into any of this. He had arranged it. The will was the first crack, not just because it existed, but because of what it meant. That document had been signed years ago, witnessed, filed, and stored. There were steps to that process, people involved, checks in place, records that didn't just disappear unless someone made them disappear. I pictured the office where Nancy and I sat that afternoon, the desk, the folders, the quiet shuffle of papers as the attorney walked us through each page. Everything had been clear, balanced, final. And yet, somewhere between that room and the filing cabinet downstairs, something had changed. Not by accident. A document doesn't rewrite itself. That meant someone inside had touched it, someone who knew where it was, how to access it, and how to replace it without raising a question. A clerk, a paralegal. Someone who understood the process well enough to move through it without leaving a trace. Caleb worked in private equity. He spoke the language of systems and leverage, of moving assets quietly from one place to another. I used to think it was just business talk, something that didn't cross into real life. Now, I could see the shape of it in something much more personal. The numbers lined up too cleanly to ignore. The estate wasn't massive, but it wasn't small either. Just over 400,000 once everything was accounted for. Enough to matter. Enough to motivate someone who knew how to turn paper into access. If the will had been altered, even slightly, that balance would shift. A percentage here, a redistribution there. Small changes on the surface, but enough to redirect the outcome completely. Enough to make one person's share disappear into another's. And Aaron. Aaron had been removed from the equation entirely. That part didn't sit as a coincidence anymore. The charges against him had been built on transactions that pointed in one direction, a trail of activity that made him look responsible for something he didn't do. I remembered the way the case had been presented, neat, organized, almost too clean. Accounts connected through layers that looked complicated but resolved in a straight line when you followed them through. That kind of structure doesn't come from chance. It comes from design, from someone who knows exactly how much detail is enough to convince, and how much is too much. There had been other people involved. There had to be. The financial records alone would have required access. Someone inside a system. Someone who could create entries, move them, position them, so they pointed where they needed to point. A brokerage contact. A middle layer. The kind of person who doesn't ask questions as long as the compensation is right. It didn't take a large group. Just the right ones. A connection in a law office. A connection in finance. Two quiet hands, adjusting things where no one was looking. Caleb had been in this house, at this table, speaking about deals and structures as if it were all abstract. Numbers on a page. Strategies that lived somewhere outside the people affected by them. I used to nod along, not fully understanding, not needing to. Now those same words sounded different in my head. Allocation, restructuring, control. He hadn't been describing work. He had been describing a method. He didn't act on impulse. He built outcomes. Every dinner, every conversation, every quiet moment he spent under this roof, it had all been layered on top of something else. Something that started long before I ever noticed it. Maybe even before he married Sophie, the thought came in without warning and stayed there, heavier than the rest. If he had planned this from the beginning, if Aaron's case and the will were part of the same structure, then none of it had been reactive. It had all been set in motion, and I had been standing in the middle of it the entire time, watching it happen without seeing it, which meant the only thing left to figure out was how much of it was already done and how much was still waiting to happen. I came down just before dawn, the sky outside still holding that thin gray line between night and morning. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. I moved through the kitchen without turning on the lights, opened the side door, and stepped out into the cold. The air hit sharp against my face, steadying something that had been building all night. Aaron's car was parked 2 houses down, engine off, lights dark, nothing about it drawing attention unless you were looking for it. I crossed the yard slowly, hands in my coat pockets, and got in on the passenger side. He didn't look over right away. Both hands rested on the steering wheel, eyes forward, posture straight like he had been sitting there for a while. When he finally turned toward me, there was no urgency in his expression, just focus. A folder sat on his lap, thick enough that it didn't bend when he shifted it slightly. Paper, evidence, time, collected and organized. "You saw it," he said. I nodded once. "The safe, the document." He exhaled through his nose, a small release of tension that didn't change the rest of him. "Good. That means he's still following the pattern." He tapped the folder lightly with his fingers, not looking down at it. I needed him to go back to it. Needed confirmation that he hadn't moved anything. I turned in my seat to face him more directly. "How long?" The question came out quieter than I expected. 8 years, he said. No pause, no hesitation, just the number, placed between us, as it had always been there. He reached into the folder and adjusted the top stack, not opening it, just aligning the edges. At first, I didn't have enough. Just inconsistencies, things that didn't match what I knew to be true. Then patterns started to show up. Same names, same accounts, same timing, across different records. He spoke the way he always did, when he was certain, measured, controlled, every word placed exactly where it needed to be. I couldn't act on any of it, not legally, not without something solid. "And now?" I asked. He glanced at me briefly, then back to the windshield. Now he made a mistake. Another small pause. He came back into the system. Same behavior, same access point. That gives me leverage. I leaned back against the seat, letting that settle. The cold from outside still clung to my jacket, mixing with the faint warmth of the car. "You've been watching him this whole time." "Tracking," Aaron corrected. "Watching implies I was close. I wasn't, not until recently." "And you didn't tell me." He didn't respond right away. His jaw shifted slightly, then relaxed. "If I told you, you would have confronted him." He turned his head just enough to meet my eyes. "And if you confronted him, he would have adjusted, moved things, covered his tracks. I couldn't risk that." I looked down at my hands, resting on my knees, noticing the slight tremor I hadn't felt until that moment. "So you let him stay in my house?" "I let him believe he was safe," Aaron said. "There's a difference." Silence filled the space between us for a few seconds, not empty, just settled. I could hear the faint ticking of the engine cooling, the distant sound of a car passing somewhere down the street. It all felt normal in a way that didn't match what we were talking about. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. Aaron's answer came without delay. "Nothing." He shifted in his seat, finally turning toward me fully. "That's the hardest part. You don't change anything. You don't ask questions. You don't act differently around him." His voice stayed even, but there was weight behind it now. "You let him think he's already won." I held his gaze for a moment, searching for something in it that might suggest doubt. There wasn't any, just certainty, the kind that doesn't come from guessing. "Don't say anything," he added. "Not to Sophie, not to anyone, especially not to him." He reached down and closed the folder, pressing it flat against his leg. "We're close, closer than we've ever been. If he feels that, even a little, he'll pull back. And if he pulls back, we lose him." I nodded slowly, the movement feeling heavier than it should have. "So I go back inside and pretend." "You go back inside," Aaron said, "and you do exactly what you've always done." I looked out through the windshield toward the house, the windows still dark, the shape of it unchanged against the early light. For years I had lived there without question, moving through the same rooms, trusting the same people. Now I was being asked to step back into that space with everything I knew and carry it like it didn't exist. I opened the door, the cold air slipping back in as I stepped out. Before closing it, I paused, one hand resting against the frame. "Aaron," he looked over. "If he's been this careful for this long, what makes you think he won't see this coming?" Aaron didn't answer right away. He just watched me for a second, then gave the slightest shake of his head. "Because he doesn't think there's anything left to see." The restaurant sat on the corner of a quiet downtown block, all glass and soft light, the kind of place where voices stayed low and nothing ever seemed out of place. I arrived a few minutes early and was led to the back, where a long table had already been set. White cloth pulled tight, candles spaced evenly, each one flickering just enough to make the room feel warmer than it was. 8 seats, fresh flowers in the center. Everything is arranged with care. Sophie had planned it. I could see it in the details. I took my seat near the end and kept my hands folded on the table, watching the room fill slowly. Megan White arrived next, her coat still catching the cold from outside. She met my eyes for a second longer than usual before sitting beside me. No greeting beyond a quiet nod. She didn't need one. The way she held herself told me everything. She knew. She had known long enough for it to settle into something steady. Caleb and Sophie came in together a few minutes later. He had his hand at the small of her back, guiding her forward with that same easy confidence he carried into every room. Sophie smiled as she greeted the others, her voice light, unaware of anything beyond the evening she had spent weeks putting together. Caleb moved around the table, shaking hands, leaning in slightly when he spoke, adjusting the flow of conversation without anyone noticing. He was good at it, always had been. People listened when he talked. They leaned closer without realizing why. Dinner began the way these things always do. Bread, wine, small talk that built into something fuller. Caleb told a story about a recent deal, his tone casual but precise, choosing just enough detail to sound impressive without losing anyone. Laughter followed in the right places. Glasses were raised. He glanced toward me once, a brief acknowledgement, nothing more. I returned it with the same stillness I had carried all evening. Megan remained quiet beside me, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, unmoving. Sophie asked her a question at one point, something simple about work, and Megan answered without hesitation, her voice even, controlled. No sign of strain, no shift in tone. If anything, she seemed more composed than anyone else at the table. The main course arrived, plates placed carefully, the soft clink of silverware against china, filling the brief gaps between conversation. Caleb was mid-sentence again, describing something about restructuring assets, his hands moving slightly as he spoke, shaping the idea in the air. It was the same language, the same rhythm I had heard so many times before, familiar enough that it almost faded into the background. Then the front door opened. It wasn't loud, just a change in the air, a slight movement that drew attention without asking for it. A few heads turned near the entrance, then more. Conversations softened, then paused. The shift moved through the room slowly, like a ripple crossing water. Aaron walked in without hesitation. Dark suit, no tie, his posture straight, his pace measured. 2 people followed behind him, both in plain clothes, both carrying themselves with the same quiet authority. He didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the room. His focus stayed fixed ahead as he moved between the tables, each step steady, unhurried. Sophie saw him first. Her face lit up for a brief second, surprise cutting through the evening. "Aaron?" she said, her voice rising slightly as she half-turned in her chair. "I didn't know you were." The rest of the sentence didn't come. She saw the others behind him. Something in her expression shifted, the smile fading before it could fully settle. Caleb turned a moment later, slower, as if he had already sensed the change before he saw it. His eyes met Aaron's across the room. For a fraction of a second, something moved there, not fear, not yet, just recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by the same composed expression he wore everywhere else. Aaron stopped at the head of the table, close enough now that there was no distance left to soften anything. The candles flickered slightly in the movement of air as he came to a halt. No one spoke. No one moved. "Caleb Price," Aaron said, his voice calm, clear, carrying just far enough for the table to hear. Caleb straightened slightly in his chair, his hands resting flat against the tablecloth. "What is this?" "Caleb," he asked, the words controlled, measured, as if he could still shape the moment by how he responded. Aaron didn't answer that question. He reached into his jacket, not quickly, not slowly, and removed a set of papers, holding them at his side. "You're under arrest," he said. The words landed without force, but they didn't need it. For financial fraud, evidence tampering, and interference with a legal instrument. Silence followed, not empty, but heavy. The kind that settles over a space and holds it in place. Sophie's hands tightened slightly around her napkin, her eyes moving between them, searching for something that made sense. Megan didn't move at all. Caleb's gaze stayed on Aaron, his expression shifting just enough to show calculation now. Measuring, adjusting, looking for an angle that wasn't there. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Aaron held his position. "Stand up." One of the agents stepped forward, the movement smooth, practiced. Caleb hesitated for a second, just long enough to register that this wasn't something he could redirect. Then he pushed his chair back and stood. The room seemed to pull in around the table, every other sound fading out, glasses untouched, plates forgotten, eyes fixed on a moment that had already moved past the point of stopping. As the agent reached for him, Caleb's eyes shifted once, not to Aaron, not to Sophie, but to me. And for the first time that night, I saw something real break through the surface, something he hadn't planned for. 3 weeks later, the house felt different again. Not because anything had changed on the surface, but because something that had been out of place for years had finally been set back where it belonged. The morning light came through the kitchen window the same way it always had, stretching across the counter, catching the edge of the old coffee maker, settling into the corners without asking permission. I stood there with a mug in my hand, watching it happen, letting the quiet sit the way it was meant to. The original will was back where it should have been, not hidden, not altered, not reduced to something it was never meant to be. Nancy's words, her decisions, her handwriting, all of it restored and filed the way we had intended from the beginning. I had run my fingers over the paper once, just to be sure it felt real, just to confirm that something that had been taken could actually be returned. Aaron came by that morning without calling first. He stepped into the kitchen, set his keys on the counter, and nodded once. Nothing dramatic, nothing unnecessary. The case had moved through the system the way it was supposed to this time. Records re-examined, charges reviewed. The weight that had been placed on his name years ago had finally been lifted, piece by piece, until there was nothing left holding it down. He didn't talk about it much. He didn't need to. The way he stood there, steady, present, was enough. Sophie sat at the table, both hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold a while ago. She hadn't said much since that night, not because there were no words, but because none of them seemed to land where they needed to. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way someone does when something they trusted turns out to be something else entirely. I walked over and put my hand on her shoulder, feeling the slight tension there before it gave way. She leaned into me without saying anything, and I pulled her closer, the way I used to when she was younger, and the world didn't make sense yet. We stayed like that for a moment, just standing in the middle of the kitchen, the three of us, with the sound of the clock on the wall marking time the way it always had. No rush. No need to explain anything further. I used to think trust was something you gave once and held on to, something that stayed in place if you did your part. Now I understand it differently. Give it to the wrong person, and it doesn't just disappear. It gets used against you. But silence, the right kind of silence, isn't weakness. It's control. It's knowing when to wait, when to let something unfold until the truth can't stay hidden anymore. Family isn't supposed to break like that. And when it does, The only thing that holds is what was real to begin with. So I'll ask you this. If you found yourself in that moment, knowing what I knew, would you have said something right away, or would you have stayed quiet and let it come to you?